Diana is the last on the list. So for the interest of time, let's get started. And Larry, the floor is yours. Please carry it away.
Yeah, so
And let me start recording.
presenter mode. Hello. Uh, okay, so my paper is on job quality and automation. Do more automatable occupations have different job quality? I don't know. Oh yeah. So job quality is a broad measure of economic and non-economic benefits that people derive from the job. So economic benefits would include, salary, wages, and fringe benefits. Non-economic ones would include things like, controlling one's task, schedule control, level of job security, meaning derived from work, and the ability to pursue free time. Um, there's been, a lot of literature also about the economics of job quality by automation. So we know from a famous paper by Frey and Osborne about 8 years ago that highly automatable occupations are lower skilled and less paid. Though it also depends on the type of automation that's happening. So, for instance, robot oriented automation tends to target the lower paid, the blue collar workers, and then AI would be for the more highly skilled occupations. We also know that there's been voluminous literature. I mean, more than I cite here, about experiences of job quality. So people are concerned about surveillance that happens as a result of technological tools. And we also know that there's a big literature about the historical evolution of job quality, where basically the post-World War II era was very unusual, with high levels of unionization and spread of like good job quality structures. But since the 1970s, in most Western countries, we've seen, because of shareholder value, information communication technology, globalization, it all falls away. So what I'm trying to do in this paper is to test the empirical relationship actually between, automatable occupations and non-economic measures of job quality. So I'm using linear and logit regressions with the dependent variable drawn from the General Social Survey, and those measure job quality. There's like 5 waves every 4 years, and so the levels of measures I have is how hard or difficult is it to take time off. The higher the value, the better the job. That's why the good in parentheses. Respondent has a job other than main, so that's the only binary outcome with the logit regression. And if the indicator is yes, then this would be a bad job feature. Fringe benefits are good. That's a good job indicator. Job security is good. Respondent's health in general is good. Job satisfaction in general is good. And how often respondents find work stressful. As for the explanatory variables, so I draw from 4 different data sources. The one is from the Frey and Osborne paper, where they have 702 occupations that they rank from the least automatable, like the recreational therapist, to the most automatable, depending on telemarketers and title examiners. I don't have time to talk about the methodology, but their paper talks about it extensively. A second measure is by Webb. And he basically uses patent keywords of existing patents to see whether jobs are automatable based on those 3 indicators: robot, software, and AI. And he has raw percentile measures from the least automatable to the most automatable, and I use the indicator from 0.01 to 1. The third measure is drawn from World Clems, so it's like a measure of capital intensity by industry. So the KO ratio is capital spending divided by gross output. This is the one that I report here. And then the KL ratio is capital spending and labor spending. This is what I don't report here, but I have in the appendix of the paper. And so this is the only time variant measure elected 4 years to the dependent variables between 1998 and 2014. And then lastly, it's employment projections, 2018 to 2028 by occupation. That's drawn from ONET. So I basically code as one the declining numbers prediction for occupations in the future, and 0 for stable and increasing number of jobs. It's not that's not a pure measure of like automation, but I still argue in the paper that it's a valid proxy for automation because employment declines in the recent past have been primarily driven by automation rather than trade. And also there's been some declining occupations that have stable or rising consumer demand, which means that it's not consumer demand, but automation that probably leads to a decline in occupation. And then I have some, demographic controls, also year dummy that's coded binary. So just descriptive statistics. I mean, so the lower end for the dependent variables is because the General Social Survey only asks a subset of all the GSS respondents, those job quality questions. So here's the overall results. So where I left it blank, it basically means that non-significant results. And just to summarize, so we have overall like a consistently negative relationship, for highly automatable occupations for three measures: for job satisfaction, for health, and for job security. There's also negative association for highly automatable occupations for likelihood of having second job. So and there's positive association for time off. And then so if you were to look at whether these are good or bad job indicators that highly automatable occupations would displace, we'll see that it's bad job indicators for job satisfaction, for self-rated health, and for job security. So it would be on the welcome end. These would be lower quality jobs. But then good job features that it would take away is the ability to take not to have need a second job, and the ability to take time off. And then for the other two measures, sort of like mixed findings for stress and fringe benefits. So on the conclusion slide, so we know that there's a lot of studies about automation job quality, but the relationship has been underexplored. Highly automatable occupations exhibit some features that correspond to higher levels of job quality, like not needing to require a second job, and taking time off is feasible in these jobs. But they also exhibit lower levels of job quality, like less satisfaction, less health, and less job security. So overall, there's it's insufficient to focus automation research on occupations that are likely to be automated. It's also important to sort of understand whether the present trend towards automation affects the good or the bad jobs. And just normatively speaking, labor-friendly automation should take the views of labor into account and the desire for creative, stimulating, and self-controlling work. And of course, there's limitations, as in any study. Automatability of an occupation, the measures that are used for the explanatory variables, does not mean automated. And also the authors who created these indexes also make that point very clear. So the results here have to be carefully interpreted. In the future, qualitative studies need to better understand the link between automation and job quality. And occupation measures of automation that are used has to be contrasted with the job quality measures that are used at the individual level. So of course, there's like a potential mismatch between individual measures versus occupation measures. But this is the best data that I have for this particular paper. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry. And by the way, Larry is a PhD candidate from Princeton University. He's also on the job market this year. So if anyone is interested in working with Larry, or you bring Larry to their department, feel free to reach out to Larry.
And I very appreciate that. Yeah.
Our next presenter is Andrew Lever from University of Illinois and at Urbana-Champaign, and he's going to talk about employee spouse training and technical changes. Sorry, Andrew, please carry away.
Okay. This. Okay. Hold on. Sorry about that. Let me restart here. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about employer-provided training and technical change, particularly in manufacturing. This is research I've been conducting with Suyeon Kang, also at Illinois. So why focus on this topic? I think we all know that training is critical for both wages and productivity. Technical change drives changes in skill demands. In general, I don't think most of us don't expect educational institutions to bear the full weight of that. Employer-provided training is important. Firm-specific skills, are another source of that drives our attention to firm-provided training. And there's a lot of economic debates about skill gaps and income inequality, and regardless of where you stand on those, training is almost always one of the solutions, so we want to understand more about it. What do we know about training? In the US, not so much. Most of the recent data we have is based on individual surveys, asking people, did you receive training? The last time we had nationally representative data on employer side data on provision of training was the 1990s. That yielded some of the kind of familiar results that, establishments with more educated workers, train more, larger firms provide more training, but a lot of conditions have changed since then. And it's not really clear that provides us the roadmap to understand how training and human capital investments are going to evolve going forward. What do we know about training and technical change in particular? Again, not that much. There are some researchers who really emphasize that in order to get the benefits out of kind of technological investments, there have to be corresponding investments in human capital. This emphasizes the complementarity. To the extent that this is the overriding factor, we would expect to see higher rates of training in high technical change environments. By contrast, there are other researchers who find significant substitution effects. This is kind of the de-skilling perspective. Certain types of technological investments may substitute for skill and lower the provision of training. There's also kind of a skill obsolescence perspective. We know from research that kind of higher changes in technology render skills obsolete more quickly. This could cut either way for training. There's some evidence that high technical change industries compensate for this effect by training more frequently and increasing training. There's other research indicating that, people retire earlier and that reduces the need for training. So, it could go either way. And finally, there's kind of this general specific skill lens to look at the issue through. There's research, and some people have argued that faster technical change leads to greater skill specificity in manufacturing. That would possibly tend to increase the firm level provision of training. At the same time, a lot of recent technical change has been IT oriented. A lot of people think of IT as a very general platform skill that might decrease the amount of firm provided training. So again, there's some ambiguity. In this presentation, we are not going to take a very theory-driven approach. We're basically going to be empirically looking at what are the correlations that we see with this nationally representative data and kind of establish some basic facts, before wading into some of these debates. So presentation goals, we're going to explore correlations between longitudinal industry-level technical change and cross-sectional plant-level employer-provided training using a nationally representative data set on US manufacturers. And we're also going to explore interactions between other predictors of firm establishment level training and these longitudinal industry technical change factors. This is just, I think we all know what manufacturing production workers are. The survey that this is based on was something I conducted a few years ago with Paul Osterman in kind of late 2012, early 2013. The key thing to note is it's based on a nationally representative random sample. Also, it has a high response rate for a mailed survey. Typical mailed survey response rates are in the single digits. This was an expensive survey where we used a lot of techniques to get the response rate up. In terms of survey design, it has a battery of kind of concrete skill and training questions. There's some definitions there, and it collects a lot of information on establishment and workforce characteristics. In terms of measures of technical change, we use several. One is total factor productivity change, and we're specifically using a Malmquist index to measure that. It's kind of a non-parametric measure of distance to the production frontier. We also use IT changes in IT capital intensity. This is essentially IT capital investment as a percentage of total capital investment. We have data on robot, and these are at the 4-digit NAICS code level. We have data on robot installations. That data gets a little spottier going farther back. There are a lot of zeros, so we use more recent both levels and change for that, and a lot of that is at the 3-digit NAICS level. And then we use one non-technological trend variable, the exposure to the China shock, which is the change in Chinese, the Chinese import penetration ratio, again at the 4-digit industry level for the kind of 2-decade period listed. In all these cases, we control for the base level and then measure change over time. And that's just some Malmquist stuff. Empirical specification, establishment level analysis. We're running logit models where the dependent variable is an indicator for establishment level provision of formal training. So this is the extensive margin, not the intensive margin of exactly how many hours. That's the estimating equation. The figures I'm going to show are all marginal effects. There's some descriptive statistics I'm just going to blow by, except to note that it turns out in these data, 49% of US manufacturing plants offer formal training. When that question was last asked of employers in a nationally representative way in the mid-1990s surveys, the answer, depending on which survey you looked at, was 70 to 80%. So we've arguably seen a significant decline in the extensive margin provision of formal training. So what are our results here? We can take a look. The first line is telling you that plants in industries that have experienced greater levels, greater amounts of total factor productivity change from 1991 to 2011 have a significantly higher probability of providing formal training. By contrast, plants in industries where IT capital investment, IT capital intensity has increased more, have a significantly lower level of probability of providing formal training. We don't see any significant main effects from the China shock. That these coefficients are nearly zero and they're not precisely measured. I will show in a second. We do see some significant interaction effects, and then robot installations. We see, and here I put in both the base level and the change over time. These effects are really small, but greater robot installations is associated with a lower probability of providing formal training to your production workers. And this final thing, the industry percentage just says, if your industry was more likely to provide training in the 1990s, they're less likely to provide it now in terms of probability. There's been convergence to a lower level of training. All right. So, whoops. Okay. So what this is an interaction effect showing the effect of a variable measuring whether a given plant has above average levels of technology as would be determined by a group of industry experts. In general, above average technology at the plant level is associated with a greater probability of providing formal training, except in robot heavy environments. In robot dense environments where there's higher levels and more kind of change over time in robot installations, percentage change over time, their high technology status does not imply an association with a greater probability to provide formal training. IT, we see kind of a downward slope here similarly, but the effects are much less precise. By contrast, TFP change, above average technology at the plant level in an industry that's been experiencing high TFP change, that is associated with a greater probability of providing formal training. And we don't see a ton of action here in the China shock for this one. Next set I want to show you the red line here is process innovation, frequent plants that engage in frequent process innovation. Blue line is plants that engage in frequent product innovation. In general, process innovation is associated with a higher probability of providing formal training, product innovation with a lower probability. We can see here that process innovation is, again, associated with higher probability of formal training, but except in, high robot kind of installation environments, there the probability of formal training declines. We see the same dynamic with IT change, where we have process innovation associated with a higher probability of formal training, except in high IT change environments. A bit the opposite dynamic with product innovation. And once again, TFP shows a completely different pattern. Process innovation in a high TFP change industry, that is associated with more, not less, higher, not lower probability of formal training. China shock looks more like IT and robot investment in this case. High process innovation is associated with higher probability of formal training unless it's in an industry that was hit hard with the China shock, in which case it's not. And this final set of interactions are related to skills, advanced, plant level requirements for advanced computer skills, ability to learn new skills, and unique skills only demanded by your plant. And we don't see any sensitivity to the relationship of these skills and the probability of formal training based on robot installations. For the most part, we don't see sensitivity to these skill demands and formal training probabilities, with relation to IT investments. We don't see, relationships with TFP between these skill kind of training relationships and TFP investments. You can kind of squint at this and say, well, in the advanced computers, this is the China shock, maybe in industries that were hit hard by the China shock, advanced computer demands have some association, but it's not significant. So I'm gonna just go to the implications here. There's no one form of technology or technical change. High, plant level technology in industries with greater IT or robot automation investments appears to be associated with human capital kind of substitution effects and less training. By contrast, in industries with high TFP growth, net of substitution-oriented IT and robot investments, above average plant technology is associated with more of these complementarity effects and thus more training. And the same pattern holds for process innovation, where IT and robots, more substitution, TFP, more complementarity. China shock potentially looks like it could this is not a causal research design, but could discourage domestic process innovators from following high capital investment training strategies like other process innovation firms that are less hit by the China shock. And the relationship between skills, we just don't see a lot of action there. It's possible that manufacturing industry training has been reduced to kind of an inelastic core that's just not sensitive to these kind of technology and trade changes. Possible that these days most skills are general and again are not sensitive to these kind of changing technology questions in terms of provision of formal training. That remains to be seen. But ultimately, whether technical change leads to greater or lower firm investments in human capital depends in part on the nature of the technical change. There are both substitution and complementarity effects, but they're not consistent across all technical change. That's that.
Thank you, Andrew, for a great presentation and also great time management. And our next presenter is Turner Cotterman from Carnegie Mellon University, and he's also a PhD candidate. I'm not sure, how far along you are in the progress, but I'm really glad that, you are from engineering, right? Like, it's really great to see the interdisciplinary scholar and then join the LERA discussion, talking about worker skill, occupation, and the electrified vehicles. So please carry it away, Turner.
Excellent. Well, very excited to be here. My name is Turner Cotterman. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University, and I have an engineering background. This is my first exposure to LERA, so very excited to be here and excited to share my results with you. This is what I'm presenting here. This is ongoing research, so I'll kind of show you where I'm at and then show you what my planned next steps are for continuing this work. So this work looks at the transition to electric vehicles and what that means for the automotive manufacturing industry, as well as for worker skills and occupations. So firstly, as we talk about this transition to electric vehicles, it's well underway. There's plenty of countries out there that have announced kind of targets. And then we've got this recent evidence in the US, where we have some of our automakers, for example, GM's recent announcement that demonstrates that that they have intention to move very quickly and very soon to all electric designs. So given the nature or kind of the phenomenon that's going on right here, we would anticipate that the labor implications of this change will be very important. Firstly, because the automotive sector in this country employs well over 3 million workers. The jobs in this industry have historically been really well paying, and even currently they're averaging around $24 an hour. And so we would anticipate that any kind of disruptions in the manufacturing space would be negatively consequential for employment and skill changes, and could potentially represent a bottleneck as we transition to electric vehicles. So I first turned to the skill bias technical change literature for examining this research topic. Plenty of research over the last few decades that describes how technological change has been responsible for these shifts in employment, wages, and skill demand. It also explains that we have this higher demand for higher skilled workers relative to lower skilled workers, and that within different skill groups, we have wage inequality. And then we have a lot of economic models that have worked to explain this technology change, have often conflated the different types of technology change. So then we insert our question here, and we kind of flag this and say that we think that EV technology, electric vehicle technologies, have the potential to be kind of in this SBTC literature. We'd also anticipate that they could lead to deunionization and reduced wages for workers. Beyond the academic literature, we also look at some of the policy or industry studies that are coming out when we talk about electric vehicle labor. And these studies the landscape is pretty mixed. We have these conflicting predictions about what's going to happen. So on the one hand, we have these studies that are coming out that says that internal combustion engine vehicles are going to require more labor involvement than their counterpart than electric vehicles. So I have a quote from a German automotive consulting agency that says that internal combustion engines have an order of magnitude more components than the electric vehicle. And this implies, or this just demonstrates that they're going to require less labor. Ford's president recently said that when they're building their new electric vehicle factories, it's going to require 30% fewer labor hours. And just a couple of weeks ago, the New York Times came out with a quote right along these lines here too. So that's one side of the picture. The other side says that actually electric vehicles are going to require more labor. So a teardown by an investment bank showed that because electric vehicles have 6 to 10 times more electronics in their systems, they're going to require more labor. And we have this automotive consultant who just says it's flat out wrong that they're easier to build. It's actually the opposite. And then one more study here, the Boston Consulting Group came out last year, and they did analysis between these two different vehicle types, and they found they're about similar. So we're entering this picture where it's not really clear what it means in terms of labor. There's studies that fall on either side of the spectrum. So we step in with our research, and we propose to empirically address what's going on and this uncertainty. So specifically, we want to understand what the labor or the occupation skill implications of manufacturing your conventional or your internal combustion engine vehicles to these new electric vehicles. What's unique about our approach? One, we're going out and we're collecting our own process level detailed data. And then secondly, we're applying a novel method. I'll explain this in the presentation to this question that no one's done here before. So when the methods that I'm using here, the methods are used to model the labor and production requirements of these emerging electric vehicle technologies. We use this technique called process-based cost modeling. It's not a new technique. It's been around for a number of decades. And what it does is it predicts or evaluates the economics of manufacturing processes and their implications before this large-scale investment. And it relies on this engineering-based approach. What's different about process-based cost modeling than a lot of economic models is that it's forward-looking. It makes predictions about what the future production costs are going to be, and then answers questions about how will these emerging technologies and their various configurations affect production costs. I'll note that this technique has been applied in the automotive discipline before. I've listed a couple papers here, so I'm not the first to apply it to automotive. And then we couple this process-based cost model with the ONET survey instrument, which is going to allow us to quantify skill implications of producing components at each production step, as well as estimate what future skill requirements are going to be. So we use ONET, and I guess for this audience, it's probably not as necessary that I describe fully what ONET is. I think you guys are understand what's going on, but we turn first to the ONET database, and it's a large database, and we pick out 7 skills that we think are relevant for our purposes that we're going to go out and survey workers on. So ONET is produced by the Department of Labor. It draws on extensive literature. There's plenty of studies that cite ONET. And then the caveat that we have about ONET is their database is not well matched, firstly, to the automotive manufacturing sector, and secondly, to this individual granular process level analysis that we propose doing. And so when we use ONET, we're building upon previous work. It's come all in all 2021 paper, and we identify a set of relevant dimensions for our analysis. Specifically, we pick out a few skills that are social-based, physical-based, cognitive-based, and this variety of skills that we're picking out that lends strength to our data collection approach. In this table on the right-hand side of the slide here, I've listed the 7 different skills that we're going to be surveying on. They're shown kind of this first column and the bottom row on this table. And then we've got, figure dexterity, social perceptiveness, for example. And we evaluate these on a 1 to 7 range, leaning on the ONET convention, where if a worker says 1 for a particular task, that means that skill is not applicable. And then 7 would be, it's a very, very involved skill for that particular task. It's also critical for the insights that we aim to produce for this research. We want them to be grounded in reality. We want them to be usable both by policymakers and by industry representatives. So we're engaging with automotive firms to collect their data in order to develop these empirical insights. So we've done this large reach out effort, reached out to well over 14 original equipment manufacturers, as well as suppliers in the automotive space. We're in the process right now of inviting a number of suppliers who operate in the powertrain area to join us, and this is going to provide us component level production information. And we're in the process right now of signing 2 data use agreements with these large automotive makers whose production designs represent some of the leading internal combustion engine and electric vehicle powertrain designs. With these partners, we're going to be collecting shop floor level data. I say we're going to because this hasn't started quite yet, but we're kind of just on the cusp of doing this data collection. So with each partner, we're collecting from various workers on the shop floor. I've listed a number of guys on the bottom of the slide here, from operators to trainers, all the way up to engineers and managers. We'll be asking these individuals about operations and production information in their facility. We'll be conducting these semi-structured interviews that allow us to elicit their background, their training, what kind of responsibilities they have on a day-to-day basis. And then we'll also ask about the ONET skill requirements that I showed in the previous slide. So we're going to go through the data collection process, and then kind of in the meantime, I've done some preliminary modeling using this process-based cost model technique. Firstly, when we're looking at your conventional versus your electric vehicles, there's a lot that they have in common that's not really changing. So you would anticipate that the body and white structures, your vehicle doors and your chassis system, those are pretty similar. There's not a lot of variation as we transition from conventional to electric. But what is going to be different is what we call the powertrain. This is essentially everything in a vehicle that causes the vehicle to move forward. So it's your engine, your transmission, your drive shaft. This is what's going to be different and unique. So for our analysis, we zero in, we draw our system boundaries just on what's going on in the powertrain. And these are examples of the powertrain that I have in the images here, the IC on the bottom left and the electric vehicle on the bottom right. And we pick out for this initial preliminary modeling effort some of those components in the powertrain that are important for manufacturing. And we define their importance from an environmental and labor perspective basis. So for this modeling effort, I'm going to do modeling of these 6 different ICE components and these 5 different electric vehicle components. And they kind of represent some of the majority of the manufacturing costs when it comes to developing these vehicles. To do this initial modeling, I first turned to the academic literature, pulling out various cost models and inputs that I draw from, and big table. I'm not asking you to read the table, but kind of the takeaway message of this is that there's a lot of studies that have attempted to do this, but we caution taking their inputs with a grain of salt, because a lot of this information is several decades old, because their methodology is not very clear. So we use this as a first-base approach, but we caution or we hesitate, leading on these results too heavily. This plot that I'm showing here superimposes some of the initial modeling results, cost models that I get, versus what the literature estimates. So I have 3 different panels here. The leftmost panel is for internal combustion engine powertrain components. The middle panel is for the electric vehicle powertrain, and then I have the electric vehicle battery all by itself on the the third panel on the far right, because its scale kind of dwarfs all the others. And the initial takeaway that I'm showing here is that there's a lot of overlay between my green estimates and the literature's estimates, but I come in lower than a lot of the estimates, and so there's a lot of uncertainty here. And so this initial modeling effort allows us to develop priorities as we go forward and work on an industry data collection. I have 2 plots now. So this is the first plot that's going to demonstrate some initial results that we're getting from this modeling effort. Firstly, when we look at the production cost of manufacturing IC versus EVs, we see that material costs, these green bars, and battery cost are some of the largest production costs. Again, I have 3 panels here: internal combustion on the left, EV excluding the battery on the middle, and then EV battery all by itself on the right for best, base, and worst cases. So material is a large manufacturing cost, 40% for ICE and 50 to 90% of EV total cost. Well, what does this mean for labor? Firstly, labor is influential on developing material costs because through the yield and scrap rate variables. And so we would essentially say that any production failure that exists on the labor side of this analysis would result in material loss, which would affect the total overall production cost of these vehicles. And labor is also important because as we think about what electric vehicle labor is going to look like in the next few decades, we'd anticipate that it's going to be this large part in overall production costs, and probably they're going to be high wage jobs in this space. So it's going to represent a sizable influence on overall production costs and maintaining cost parity between EVs and ICEs. And then the last results slide that I have here is we're still out, and the kind of court's still out on what it means when we compare labor requirements between internal combustion engines on the left-hand side and electric vehicles on the right-hand side. And this comes from this initial slide that I showed where the landscape is unclear what it means manufacturing these two. So it's unclear because we don't know whether the best or worst cases are going to be the real pictures when we look forward. You know, it could be a best case ICE scenario and a worst case EV scenario, but we don't know, right now where we're going to land. This initial modeling effort is based on literature estimates, which we think has some limitations. For example, they're out of date. A lot of the electric vehicle estimates are missing electronics insights. And then just looking at labor insights here, we can't necessarily pick apart what the skills insights are. They don't fully correlate. And so then this is the last slide I have in the presentation. These are some of the initial insights that we're drawing from this research and what we're planning on doing next. So I've shown that material is largely influential from this process-based cost modeling technique when we look at developing these two different vehicle types. But from this initial modeling, we see that worker skills and labor are going to be very important components as we work to roll out electric vehicles quickly and at a large scale. It's unclear right now whether electric vehicles or internal combustion engine vehicles require greater labor requirements, but this is a fundamental question we're working on tackling. And we will be tackling this by collecting shop floor level data from these automotive maker and supplier partners that we're engaging with. And then we'll set the stage saying that any kind of disruptions that happen in labor space will be very, very consequential for workers, as well as for meeting these targets at kind of this national firm level that we're seeing now. So then thank you for listening to my presentation.
Thank you, Turner. So now we have 15 minutes left. Yeah, we're right on time. That's exciting. Unfortunately, we lost the final presenter and the final presentation, but that leaves more time for us to have a really kind of good discussion. And given this kind of small number of attendees, like I think we can just, if you want to ask a question, you don't have to necessarily type in the chat box. You can just turn on your mic and then we can have a real conversation. Given so far we haven't seen any questions in the chat, like I'm gonna kind of like abuse my privilege as a chair and to give a couple of kind of like comments and also questions for our presenters. I think this session built a really nice synergy in terms of like how technical changes impact like workers, right? Like, especially through the skill, occupation, and the training, kind of like it's really a good combination when we talk about things, right? Larry comes from like a general perspective, talking about like computerizations and how this changed the job and the nature of the task. And then we zoom into manufacturing when Andrew started talking about how employers moving towards, specific type of trainings and how trainings has been kind of like shifted over time in this kind of like landscape. And Turner kind of further kind of zooming into the kind of like automotive like sectors within the manufacturing and talking about the different type of actually production processes has been changed because of the product change, right? And how does this kind of change the occupation and skill? So I think that's a really beautiful kind of like a combination. But what I saw like in the current kind of like a discussion in terms of automation and like how this, let's pick the manufacturing as an example, is that we see a dual internal labor market, right? Like, the manufacturers keep the old workers in the old assembly lines. And then when they have automations or robotic kind of like productions, they bring in the new group of workers. And, and also there's a kind of discussion in terms of should we buy talent or like should we train talent. So like it's really kind of like how do we reconcile this from like the policy perspective? If the product changed, if we change the nature of the job, if we change all the skill requirement of the job, like who should be responsible for training those workers? And as Turner kind of alluded toward the end of his presentation, if we have a labor disruptions, right? Like how do we reconcile like those things within the production processes? And And a final kind of point though, that I want to make is that I'm excited that Turner goes into those production lines to collect data, and I would like strongly encourage that you connect with Larry, because like I think that the satisfaction and the stress, those data could be useful, like when you try to collect the first round of data, right? Like, not only the quality of the job, but also the well-being of the workers, right? Like, how those changes that affect workers' kind of like ability to really work in those decent jobs and avoid kind of like the labor disruptions in this process. So like I'm opening the floor. So anyone wants to jump in, feel free.
I've got a question. So Turner, are you mentioned kind of having 14 powertrain suppliers. So are you going to fully capture, but it seemed from the rest of your presentation that you were going to fully capture any increased labor kind of labor usage around the production of the batteries themselves. Is that?
Yeah, so we would say that the battery is part of the powertrain. It's one of the most expensive components of electric vehicles. So we're partnering with a few manufacturers who are involved with battery production, but you would imagine that these automotive firms, they are very unwilling to partner and very unwilling to divulge any information. So we'll have a few samples in our data set that'll give us some initial insights, but probably we won't be able to zero in on one particular component.
I guess one other question about that, you could imagine a story where batteries produced now, where batteries, it's a big industry, but it's not it's not the petroleum industry yet, where the labor intensity to kind of based on the current economies of scale is one thing. And then, when the industry goes to scale, and you could tell that either way, either they're going to hit economies of scale and, some kind of efficiency, or to get to wring that extra last bit of, efficiency out of batteries when people are really using these things in 80% of the fleet or something, is just, then you're going to have to go to a heavily labor intensive environment. So do you have any thoughts on, like, as the scale of this goes up, how this is all going to change?
Yeah, this is a cool point, because this is an ongoing conversation right now with these OEMs, with the White House. Everyone's very focused on this question, because at the end of the day, it's not a cost benefit analysis. It's not what's the most cost effective solution. Like, you pull in elements of like national competitiveness all of a sudden about maintaining unionization in these facilities. So where we end up in terms of whether we're making things domestically, what firms are involved with, for example, producing batteries, that's out right now. That's, the debate is still out, and it's not going to be resolved simply by looking at by simply this economic basis here.
Could I ask a question to Andrew? I mean, so your finding would be that more capital intensive firms would provide less training to their employees, and could you speak a little?
Only IT and robots. It's a little similar to yours.
Yeah. So do you have a little of intuition, perhaps, about what motivates and constrains these firms?
I mean, I think I was interested to see your results, because there's a little bit of overlap there. So IT, I mean, at this point, I would just speculate, this is early stages, that IT and robot capital tends to be very substitution oriented and very kind of skill substitution oriented in the way it's implemented. Now, you could imagine maybe if I was doing this in German factories, maybe they have some more complementary way of implementing robotic technology, where you have kind of highly trained technicians implementing it. But at least in the way that American plants appear to implement this stuff, those forms of capital are very substitution oriented. Other forms of capital, if the productivity changes are coming from changes, say, in industrial organization, I think that's where, when firms are redesigning the production process for greater efficiency, but they're not just plunking in a robot, or they're not just buying, some kind of manufacturing IT system, then you do see I think that's what's driving the TFP, the positive relationship with TFP and more training. So it depends on what kind of capital you're investing in, and I think how you're implementing it. If you're implementing it with like a management system and maybe a Six Sigma, whatever, that could be associated with more training. But if you're just, again, plunking in a robot in kind of a very low end substitution way, that could be associated with less training. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Also, what do you make of Darren Asimolo's argument about, tax policy, which is preferring, automation and skill substitution as opposed to, maybe shifting the taxes away from labor and more towards capital, which would presumably favor a labor-focused retraining?
I'm skeptical. I don't. So my experience is taxes don't drive business investment decisions nearly to the degree that people say they will. And the evidence on the role of taxes as a driver for is weak, I think. I don't. And so I understand that, yeah, you can have a like big macro kind of analysis and throw in a tax variable and get some. But until I see something that's like a better identification strategy around the taxes are really driving this, I don't think. And the other thing is, I really think that probably is going to break down when you look at, say, America versus Germany. So really, it's American high taxes on labor that's like, that's the problem. If we were just a low tax nation like Germany, we would have more, kind of investments in human capital and, this better way of, organizing labor around technical changes. If anything, Germany is the high tax environment and we're the low tax environment. So it's very unclear to me that taxes are but I don't know. What do you think?
I saw Helen in the audience just raise her hand, and maybe you can jump in.
Oh, sure. So thank you so much for this very interesting session. But before I ask my question, I do want to let you know that actually my 10-year-old son stayed with us for the entire session. He did not leave, so you know how much he enjoyed this session. And that's why I love this virtual environment. I have a couple questions, but I have a particular question, or it's more like a suggestion or ways to think about how it may go for the EV study, for Turner's study. So I was thinking about the internationalization strategy for the auto industry, especially for a new EV industry with one or two dominant players. So I just wondering if there are more OEM who come late to the industry but become dominant competitors in this industry. We are talking about a few competitors in Asia in terms of battery as well as in other parts of the supply chain as well. I just wonder whether that will pose a need to expand your model and to add new variables into your estimation. That's my question.
Yeah, Helen, good question. Let's see. So you're right on point that we do. Let's see. First off, we don't know who the industry leader is going to be in 10 to 20 years. There's this we're in this period of experimentation when we talk about electric vehicles. Certainly, Tesla is one of the biggest players right now, especially if you're talking about the U.S. But some of these EV OEMs out of China are really quite impressive right now. There's some coming out of Germany. There's startups that are coming up in the Midwest area in the U.S. So it's not clear right now who's going to be the overall winner. And even the powertrain designs themselves, there's a lot of it experimentation. Everybody has got these very, very different looks. I think one of the nice things about my approach is that I don't need to know who the dominant designer, who the winner is. The way that I'm setting up this engineering framework is that I can input anybody's process flow, anybody's numbers, and it'll tell me what the production costs are, and it'll tell me relative to the general landscape how competitive they're going to be. The way I see my research is that it allows us, or it enables us, to do this cross comparison of firms, especially projecting forward when it's not clear yet, who's gonna end up on top.
That was very helpful. I do have one minor question for Larry's study as well. It's a question, it's not a critique or suggestion. It's more like a question just because I love the concept and I was very impressed by the literature on job quality. But somehow I feel like if you're trying to capture some of the newer trends in what the labor market has been changing and how work organization have been transforming, I was wondering whether you want to expand our understanding of quality above and beyond job. I understand that you use the data and the data source define what job quality and what those numbers may represent in this study. But I just wonder whether this is an area that you see there could be some potential to change.
Well, so I guess the issue would be about whether there could also be better data sources, perhaps, that exist that could capture job quality much better. And I think, yeah, I mean, yeah, I could only throw it back around to say, you know, if those data sources exist, I'm sure I would like to empirically analyze that, and also like, you know, it jives with the point that I made at the end, which is that, you know, qualitative studies would perhaps also be very beneficial, you know, trying to understand, you know, at the individual level, whether people are actually satisfied with the jobs and, you know, how, you know, interacting with that technology actually does shape their work experience. I mean, we certainly see this with the study by Turner, I mean, about electric vehicles. I mean, you know, does it mean that people are, you know, do they actually enjoy working as a result of, you know, these product changes? So, yeah, there's a lot more studies that need to be done. That's my answer.
Yes, I think. Go ahead, Helen.
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you for the response. Yeah.
Thanks, Helen, for the great questions, and thank you for our presenters. Like we are kind of approach the end of the session. I think this is a great session, and we all agree. Like in this topic, we need more research to aid the policy decision making, right? So to be able to understand how do we help workers, how do we help the industries, and how do we support the countries to take like and maintain the lead, you know, in this field. So thank you for kind of engaging in this discussion, and thank you for continue and push the research forward. And I want to thank you for all the presenters and participants for these sessions, and I will see you in the other sessions as well.
Tingting, thank you so much for sharing this.
Yeah, thanks for sharing it.
Thank you, Tingting. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Larry and Andrew, nice to meet you too.
Yeah, good to meet you all.
And I hope the three of us could maybe exchange the papers, or maybe.
Yeah, I would love to see you guys. We're still at the PowerPoint stage, but I would love to see your work. Yeah.
Yeah, I see great synergies in this session. So like maybe we can kind of like have a like, you know, future Zoom meetings and to update our research program and stuff like that. Yeah. I will forward like your email address, like so you can kind of keep in touch after the conference. Great. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.